We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
We cross live now in this COVID-19 to our Geneva correspondent, Daniel Porras. Daniel, how are you?
I'm doing well. Enjoying the confinement of the moment, but it's spring and I have a big terrace, so it's actually been kind of nice.
Yeah, and Dan, what brings you to space law? What is your space law kind of expertise?
Okay, so I'm the Space Security Fellow at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. We're an independent institution that kind of sits in and out of the United Nations, and we focus a lot on disarmament issues and different types of arms control and non-proliferation. Now, most of this work usually looks at things like nuclear security or security and technology or conventional arms, but we also have an portfolio that covers space security. And the reason that we look at this is because for many years, outer space capabilities have actually been considered to be pretty integral to disarmament issues, in particular nuclear weapons. So I'm originally a space lawyer. Started out as a wee intern at the Office for Outer Space Affairs many, many years ago in Vienna, but eventually I found my way to space security. And so now we deal with some of the hairier issues related to this topic.
And how does one become a space lawyer? I presume you had to get a law degree first.
Yeah, I got a law degree, and it's not easy there's no official degree on space law. Well, at least there wasn't when I was coming up. Now there are some universities that actually do offer some emphasis in space. But the thing that I've always focused on is outer space law, particularly at the international level. You can practice this stuff at the national level with regulations and licensing, but I've been really lucky in the sense that I get to work on the development of policies and treaties at the international level.
Which is a lovely point for us to jump into the Outer Space Treaty. Just a cracking treaty if ever there was one. I've recently sat down and read the entire thing in one sitting, and it was amazing, really. It was uplifting. But particularly, we wanted to focus today on Article 4, which is really where the non-weaponsy stuff comes in. Although I guess we might also say that the stuff around outer space shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes is probably also a bit of a clue as to what's coming, a bit of foreshadowing that they put into that treaty early on. But before we jump straight into it, what is your sweater say? Your jumper in Australia?
Yeah. So let me finish my my introduction. So I am wearing a very cool Star Wars jumper. But since I am in French-speaking Switzerland, it is French. La guerre des étoiles. That's cool. It's a nice throwback sweater. And also, since we are supposed to be having drinks, I'm not going to say what hour it is here, but it's probably not okay to start drinking spirits. But I am having a nice Valaisan lager for this hour of the day.
Brilliant. Well, it is absolutely okay to be drinking spirits in Australia. So you're on our time now. This is, this is the way it works.
I appreciate it. Cheers. Sláinte, since it was just St. Patrick's Day. Okay, so right. Article 4.
Poor. I picked a very smoky Glenmorangie Scotch and I'm regretting my choices. But not at all. I think if there's going to be a pandemic, then you have to drink very strong alcohol to, kill all the bugs and so on.
My philosophy on this so far has been, if I have to go, I'm not going sober.
Fair enough. Article 4, I will read. Look, I'll read it out, unless you'd like to do the honors.
Please.
Okay. States parties to the treaty undertake not to place in orbit around the Earth any objects carrying nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction, install such weapons on celestial bodies, or station such weapons in outer space in any other manner. I think we'll pause there halfway through to talk about the first bit. Look, it sounds fairly conclusive that you're not really meant to put nukes or weapons in space. But what is a weapon of mass destruction?
So that's something that the international community has never actually defined, or even a nuclear weapon for that matter. This is one of the areas where I think the outer space law is quite interesting today, because back then it seemed like it was okay to take certain terms for granted and just sort of assume, oh, everybody knows what we mean about a weapon of mass destruction or a nuclear weapon. And now we have this understanding that those types of weapons include anything that can kill people indiscriminately once you use it, or something that will that you can't necessarily control, that once you detonate it or that you try to use it, you're not going to necessarily be able to restrict the amount of damage that it inflicts. But there's no actual definition for what either one of those things really are. I say that's interesting because today we're trying to come up with new tools to try and restrict more than just nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. But we keep getting hung up on this idea of like, well, we can't define what a weapon is in outer space. And well, how do you define this or how do you define that? And back then there was not necessarily a definition. So it challenges us today to think, do we really have to define the different things that we want to refer to in a treaty or in a provision? Or is it something that we can rely on common usage for interpretation? That's a good question.
Right, because I mean, if you think about it, a rocket is just a missile, right? It's just pointed straight up or at a different sort of angle, and maybe has a bit more fuel in it and is generally painted a different color. But it's kind of the same original technology.
Sure. I mean, we have rocket technology that is based on missile technology. So, you know, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners will already know, or viewers in this case, a lot of the US and Soviet rocket technology that was developed after World War II was based on German missile engineering that was being used for the missiles to bomb England. After World War II, the Americans and the Soviets went into Berlin, and they basically extracted as many missile engineers, yanked them back to their capital so that we could have rocket scientists. But the trick here is that when this provision was being put together, they had to take into consideration that they only wanted a very narrow scope of weapons and objects to be prohibited, precisely because there are other uses and things that you want to be able to do. So, for example, the provision says not to place in orbit around the Earth. Okay, not to place in orbit. What does that mean? What is an orbit? Well, we have an understanding that an orbit is one lap around the Earth. The reason that they use that language and didn't just say don't put nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in space is because we still have to allow for intercontinental ballistic missiles carrying nuclear weapons to travel through space.
Of course, it's very important to make sure we can still nuke each other.
Because
not in space.
Of course, because back then the Americans and the Soviets still wanted to have the ability to destroy the world. Well, at least to annihilate their rivals and opposition. But part of the reason why they did say, look, don't put nukes in space, a big part of the reason is also because, one, they didn't want nuclear weapons being used in space, and then they also didn't want nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction being deployed in space that could then be dropped from orbit. Now, one of the things we know is that the Americans and the Soviets never agreed to any restrictions unless they've already determined this is probably not the most efficient way of doing things anyway. So let's just go ahead and agree that we won't waste money on pursuing these options. They had already discovered that detonating nuclear weapons in space, particularly in the form of missile defense, is not a great idea. We had Operation Fishbowl, which resulted in the test Starfish Prime. It was a nuclear detonation in space. And what ended up happening is that there was an electromagnetic pulse that was generated by this detonation. You can look it up on YouTube. It's pretty fascinating. And it ended up knocking out a bunch of other American satellites. So they said, oh, this is not a good thing to do. Like, even for purposes of missile defense, you know, we have satellites that we rely on in order to be able to deliver our nuclear weapons. Well, maybe not such a great idea to then be using a nuclear weapon that could disable those satellites. So, okay, let's agree to not use nuclear weapons in space. And that resulted in the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1962. Then you've also got this threat of people potentially putting weapons in space and then dropping them from orbit.
Mm.
Really expensive to do, especially if you want to have missiles over one particular target at all times. Because to do that, in order to make it worthwhile, you have to be in low Earth orbit. But if you're in low Earth orbit, then you're only going to pass that target once every few hours, which means you
Right.
have to have a whole string of satellites that potentially have missiles on them going over the target all the time. So everyone said, that's not really cost effective. Okay, we can agree not to do that. We're going to agree not to put those things in space. Then you go further into the language of the text and you see that it says it only prohibits nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, which means it doesn't prohibit other types of conventional weapons from being put in space. Now, that's the big issue that we're dealing with today. What's a conventional weapon? What are the other types of things that could potentially be put in space that can create threats or risks that will generate an arms race in outer space? Back then, I don't think they really knew what those things could be. I mean, orbital vehicles were starting to emerge, some ASATs, but not a lot. Today, the range of counter space capabilities is a lot wider.
Okay, so what are the sorts of weapons that I don't know if we can say that we have them in space now. Does anyone know? I mean, like, do we know of any weapons that exist in space?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you want to call a weapon. One of the first things that came out in terms of being an anti-satellite weapon back in the Soviet era was these orbital vehicles, or essentially these probes that you could launch that would go really fast around the Earth once, and then they would catch up to a target and would get really, really close. And once they got close enough, they would detonate explosive charge, and then the shrapnel from that drone could eat up the other satellite. Now, under most definitions, I think we could say that's a weapon. It's specifically designed to go into space and to destroy something. Because I guess it goes up in space from one orbit, I guess you could say it could be placed in orbit. So maybe that's the earliest thing that we saw.
Or stationed in any other manner.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Well, and that's what we're seeing today. Now that we have orbital vehicles, for things like active debris removal or for servicing satellites, we're seeing a lot more utility for these types of drones. And some states are concerned that, yes, country A is putting up a fleet of orbital vehicles to remove debris, but what's to say that those orbital vehicles won't be used to remove one of my satellites from orbit, or to potentially jam my satellite, or to spy on one of my satellites, maybe even move close and detonate and, create a lot of shrapnel. It's really hard to tell without inspecting the craft before you launch it. And let's face it, countries don't like to let others inspect their craft. So these are the kinds of things that we are starting to worry about, because a orbital vehicle is not by definition a drone, but you could use it in a way that is weaponized pretty quickly. That's just one.
Yeah, I guess with that one, anything that can remove some debris from orbit could equally remove a functioning satellite, theoretically.
Yeah.
Like there's size issues and so on, but yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, theoretically, this spoon is a spoon until I throw it at somebody, and then by definition, it can.
But this is the great value of social distance, Dan. You see, at this distance via Zoom technology, your spoon can do no damage. The real question is, do you have plentiful supplies of toilet paper?
I do. Given my rate of usage, yes, I have more than enough.
See, it's important for me as an Australian to just leave this here so that you're aware through this conspicuous display of wealth of my social status.
Yeah, well, I guess we have gotten to that point.
We have. Right, so those are the co-orbital issues. What are the other sorts of weapons that we might have?
Well, so weapons that could potentially be placed in space. I mean, I suppose you could theoretically put missiles in orbit, like anti-satellite missiles, but where would you fire them from? Some people used to speculate that maybe the X-37B could potentially have a missile on board. I don't think so. Yeah, I definitely don't think so. But it could potentially jam other satellites, that kind of thing that actually gets deployed in space that targets other space systems. The other concern is that somebody might start putting weapons in space that can target objects on the ground. So, when to see a situation where a satellite does have like missiles on it that could be deployed to just, hit a target on the surface of the Earth. We definitely have not seen anything like that.
Gravity makes that much more effective.
Well, you would still be using a missile. There was a discussion about the tungsten rods in the past.
Yes, the
you may
rods
have heard
from
about
God. I came across this in Joan Johnson Fraser's book, Arming the Heavens, which is such a good read.
She's a wonderful writer and a great speaker.
Oh, I've never seen her speak in person, but I have like a massive academic crush. One day I hope to meet.
It's you really need to see her put somebody in their place when they try to mansplain things to her.
I follow her on Twitter. It's fantastic. But also she said once, I was reading in an interview that she gave, and she said that she couldn't stand it when she met with young women who were interested in security and so on, and that they like played with their hair while talking to her. And ever since then,
do you do that a lot?
I was like, we can never meet. Yeah, of course, it's here. It's like, it's just, it's like, it's not through wanting to constantly be changing my hairstyle. It's just, I'm just petrified now that even if I could go through days with never touching it, but the moment of meeting her, I'd just be like, still. Anyway, what can you do? This is getting very silly. But the point is, rods from God, that was this idea that you have these tungsten rods and they're sort of in this pod thing going around in orbit, and you just like drop them. And because of the acceleration due to gravity, right? And
it wouldn't even need a rocket propulsion system. It could just hit something on the ground.
And it would have this enormous crater because the impact would be huge. And it could be very accurate as well.
But the whole point of it is, though, that it's so inefficient from a cost benefit analysis that rods from God are just a fantasy.
Okay.
I suppose we could also be talking about putting a Death Star in orbit, which the Obama.
Now,
go ahead.
Well, if we were to put a Death Star in orbit, people who followed my stuff might know I did a talk on this at Physics in the Pub last year about the space law of putting a Death Star in orbit, and I actually referenced you in my talk. And my theory was you probably couldn't build one, but if you repurposed the moon using the provisions of the Moon Agreement, and if it was a Death Star for scientific purposes, you might get away with it. But calling it a Death Star was probably a bit much.
Yeah, that's the first problem. The other problem is it something that people would colloquially refer to as a weapon of mass destruction? And I think having the capacity to destroy another planet probably qualifies as a weapon of mass destruction. So you wouldn't be able to have the moon in orbit. That's the kicker. You can have a Death Star, it just can't be placed in orbit.
But the moon's already in orbit, was my argument.
Right, so you couldn't, and then for other reasons, you still couldn't use the moon to have a system that could destroy the planet.
Yeah, in fact, we should actually read the second half of Article 4, which goes directly to this point, which I chose to kind of gloss over in my talk for the purposes of comedy and beer, but yeah. The moon and other celestial bodies shall be used by all states parties to the treaty exclusively for peaceful purposes. The establishment of military bases, installations and fortifications, the testing of any type of weapons, and the conduct of military maneuvers on celestial bodies shall be forbidden. The use of military personnel for scientific research or for any other peaceful purposes shall not be prohibited. The use of any equipment or facility necessary for the peaceful exploration of the moon and other celestial bodies shall also not be prohibited. So yeah, you'd have to have a Death Star for peaceful purposes, which
then it's not really the moniker Death Star might not be terribly appropriate. One of the things that is really interesting about what you did just read, though, is that this is the catch-all for whether or not the activities you're doing are consistent with the Outer Space Treaty or not when it refers to the military. A lot of people think that the Outer Space Treaty says that all of space should be used strictly for peaceful purposes. That's actually not true, and here's the provision. The moon and other celestial bodies shall be used by all states parties to the treaty exclusively for peaceful purposes. But that's it. Anywhere else in space, it's all fair game. And that's one of the things that gets quite difficult. We often hear about a lot of countries who say, look, under the Outer Space Treaty, you can only use space for peaceful purposes. And technically, it's only the moon and other celestial bodies.
My God, you're right. Here I am trying to find the bit that says you're wrong, but I suppose, though, the Article 1, the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries. I mean, you're right in that it doesn't say for peaceful purposes, but yeah, I guess you could say that blowing something up was in the benefit of everyone, I suppose. But then because then Article 11 assumes peaceful purposes when it says, in order to promote international cooperation in the peaceful exploration and use of outer space, states parties, blah, 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 blah. So, I mean, it is kind of assuming that they said it.
The Outer Space Treaty as a whole is a very interesting document because it reflects some very lofty ideals and values, but that had to be tempered by very real geopolitical rivalries. A great example is Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which prohibits national appropriation or claims of sovereignty in space.
Yeah.
Why was that provision included? I'm often fascinated by what is, sometimes what's left out of a treaty is more interesting than what's in a treaty. But in this case, the US and the Soviets would have had very big hesitations, especially because they were so far ahead of everyone else in getting to the moon. Why is it that they agreed that there should be no sovereignty in space? And in fact, one of the things that you come across quite often is that at the time, the US had bad intelligence that the Soviets were going to get to the moon 6 months before them.
Right.
So in a way, but the Soviets at the time already knew that their program was falling behind quite a bit. So for them, it was incumbent on them to go ahead and sign the treaty. But I'm not entirely sure that the Americans would have signed the treaty had they known that they were going to get to the moon first.
Yeah, well, maybe it would have been a very different treaty. But I get what you mean. So carried out for the benefit and in the interests and promoting peaceful exploration. And then
it's a very wishy-washy term.
Yeah, the end of Article 3 is they'll carry on activities in the use of outer space in the interest of maintaining international peace and security. It's all very kind of skirting around it, isn't it?
Yeah, but that's also part of the reason why the Outer Space Treaty has been so resilient over the years. It's very general, it's very broad, and people can interpret it in a lot of different ways. So many ways, in fact, that it hasn't really prohibited any of the activities that people want to do. As far as I know, no one has tried to put nuclear weapons in space. But other than that, pretty much anything is fair game.
Yeah.
Even some of the ideas that are starting to come out about space mining, a lot of people don't think that mining in space is consistent with the Outer Space Treaty. But the treaty is so broad that you can read it in various ways that it kind of gets you to the same conclusion, where you can say, actually, okay, you're utilizing space, which is consistent with the treaty, but you're not claiming sovereignty. So, okay, we'll just go with that. And even though not everyone is convinced, because people are opting to interpret it that way, then the treaty can persist. But we are having to look at the treaty now and really focus in on some of the language that was used initially to try and get a sense of look, what kind of space do we want? What do we want the space environment to look like, and how do we want to be able to exploit it? We're pretty happy with the way things have gone so far. Yes, we see some issues where the Outer Space Treaty might need to be adapted, but not necessarily rewritten. And I think Article 4 is an excellent example of that. It is, to date, not the only, yes, it is the only multilateral arms control provision in law for outer space. There's nothing else. There are some bilateral stuff, but not multilateral. And up to now, it's held pretty well. Now, how we continue to build this body of space law, I think, is going to depend a lot on the choices we make for what we want space to look like in the future. There are lots of different visions at the moment. They're all competing, and we're going to have to make arguments about how we want to interpret these articles to match the future that we want. I would like to see a space where we continue making money. That tends to be usually like a quite stable environment, like an area where we try to keep the conflict to a minimum so that businesses and companies can keep using things can keep coming up with new applications and new activities in space that make lives better for people down here.
Sure. But regulated. Very important to regulate.
It is important to regulate because at least to some degree, because we want to try and be efficient. Now, one of the challenges that I see with the discussion on Article 4 and some of the provisions in the Outer Space Treaty today is that we keep saying that there are gaps in the law. We keep saying that the law is insufficient right now to prevent an arms race in outer space or to keep space free of conflict. I'm not sure that that's entirely true. I think we just don't know how to apply some of the laws and provisions that we have now. So, for example, Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty says that all space activities have to be carried out in accordance with international law, including the UN Charter. Well, part of the UN Charter includes international humanitarian law. It includes the law of war. It includes, prohibitions on the threat or use of force in space. Okay, well, what does a threat or use of force in space look like? And I think once we start elaborating a little bit more on how we interpret some of these provisions, we'll actually come to find that we have a much more robust system than we think. But we have to be open to some of those elaborations and interpretations. And we have to start being willing to limit the number of activities that we can do, because we say, all right, maybe there are some weapons that we want to develop and that we want to test in space, but it's going to create a lot of problems. And there are some other issues that we want other states to be good actors on. So we're going to limit our activities in certain areas so that others will limit their activities in other areas. And that way we have an environment where we can all function.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's kind of like, in some ways, it's an agreement of how we're all going to peacefully coexist, which doesn't necessarily mean that we coexist peacefully, if that makes sense, right? It just means that we won't, we're just not going to be dicks to each other in space.
Well, and this is something else that we're trying to work on now in terms of arms control and strategic stability. Even during the Cold War, I mean, even during the times when people were fighting it out on the ocean, it's not that you don't want to not fight at all, but that you want to establish some guidelines so that if you end up fighting, how are you going to do this? Like, what are the rules of engagement? What are the rules of combat? If there are no rules, then we know that things can get really messy, and that it results in a lot of human suffering. During the Cold War, the US and the Soviets found a way to manage the tension. They found different mechanisms and different tools so that they could know, all right, if the Americans do this, then the intention is that. And so as a Soviet, my calculations can rely on certain doctrines and certain policies so that I can anticipate which way the Americans are going to jump. When you start doing away with a lot of that transparency and a lot of that clarity, you don't have any rules of engagement, well, okay, all bets are off, and people could take certain measures which could result in a lot of damage for civilians, and that's what we really want to avoid.
Right. So it's kind of like a form of game theory then, in a way that it's just reducing the options by increasing transparency. And in a sense, I guess that, it's not strictly weapons, but a lot of the satellites that currently hang out in orbit spying on each other constantly probably serve that purpose by providing that transparency and reducing, on one hand, the likelihood that one country will start stockpiling tons of nukes, and on the other hand, the likelihood that one country will suspect that the other country is stockpiling loads of nukes. And that goes both ways, and therefore overall might reduce nuke stockpiling, potentially.
Well, and that's one of the things that we're looking at now to see if that's a possibility. So just because countries are in an arms race doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get to the point where somebody pulls the trigger. So, for example, we've been having a lot of discussions recently about missile defense and whether or not that upset strategic stability. Now, when I talk about strategic stability, I kind of think of it as what is probably no longer politically correct to say, but you know what a Mexican standoff is. Everyone's got guns pointed at each other and nobody pulls a trigger, because as soon as one person pulls, everybody pulls and we all die. So when missile defense first appeared, there was the concern from the Soviets that missile defense was going to take away the effectiveness of their nuclear arsenal, because they're thinking like, well, right now the Americans don't fire their nukes at us because they're worried that if they fire first, we're going to fire second and we'll all die. But then you get missile defense and they say, well, wait a minute, if the Americans fire first and we fire second and they can block all our missiles, then there's no reason for them not to shoot at us first. Well, what we eventually found out is that missile defense isn't that effective, and there are lots of ways that you can counter it. One perfectly good example is a multiple controlled reentry vehicle, a MIRV. So one warhead can have lots of little missiles, or like one rocket can have lots of warheads on it. You can launch dummy missiles, and then the missile defense tries to shoot all those down, and then you just launch a second wave of a whole bunch more missiles. Even hypersonics are kind of overkill because missile defense just isn't that effective. And so as the US and the Soviets continued to look for these different weapons and these different systems, even though they kept developing new systems, they always maintained that sort of balance that said, okay, you don't shoot, because if you shoot, I'm going to get you back. The trouble we're having now with some of the space security stuff is, or with some of the counter space capabilities, is one, nobody really understands just how dependent their strategic systems are on space. I mean, we know it's vital. You're not going to fire an ICBM today without satellites to target and control and for all the different commands. But how do you take that system down? How many satellites is it going to take to critically, injure or to critically inhibit that system? We don't know. And what's the standard of activity or the standard of behavior for these co-orbital vehicles? How many co-orbital vehicles are there? Are they getting too close to strategically sensitive satellites? We don't know yet. And because there's no established form of conduct, it creates a lot of tension, it creates a lot of uncertainty, and so people get antsy. And when people get antsy, itchy trigger fingers.
Yeah.
And that's what we're worried about.
Do you think we're more antsy than we were 20 years ago?
Yeah, but that's not because of space.
Right.
Right now, relationships between some of the big military space powers are just at an all-time low for other reasons.
Sure.
And the less trust there is, it's just like any fire needs a couple of different elements. And, you need tinder, you need some oxygen, you need a spark. And it just seems like other relationships are making things tense between some of the big rivals. In addition, there are more rivals in space now. In the old days, it was just the Americans and the Soviets. Now you've got, the Chinese are definitely a big major military space power. The Indians are a major military space power. The Europeans certainly could be, and a number of countries are now making steps to becoming themselves big military space powers, like Japan, like France, like India further. Even NATO announced that they want to, not that they want to be conducting military activities in space, but they've designated space as a domain of operations. And they've said that if there's an attack on a satellite, that they will consider that sufficient for collective self-defense. But what's an attack? This goes back to the idea of what's within the rules and what's out of the rules.
Right.
Is jamming a satellite an attack?
Well, you'd hope
we don't
not,
know.
or we'd all be blown up right now.
Yeah, because the major military forces are in fact jamming their stuff all the time. The U.S. just announced that they've just unveiled their new offensive jamming platoon. Okay, great. Like, just put it out there.
Sure.
But we know it exists, and we know that countries are doing these things. Our concern is, at the moment, there's some tolerance of like, oh, okay, we're NATO and we're carrying out some war games and some war exercises, and the GPS isn't working great. Okay, we're going to tolerate that. But at what point does Russia maybe probe that system and then trigger something that they didn't intend? Or maybe the United States starts probing China a little bit on what they can jam and what they can't. And one day they, jam something that just goes a little too far, and China gets spooked and things ramp up. We don't know.
Yeah, it's really interesting because cyber is kind of its own domain in terms of attacks and so on, and that's like growing enormously, of course, because it's growing enormously, and also it's growing enormously as a domain for countries to prod each other. But at the same time, it has this physical dependence on space. It like cyber relies on these satellites being there and not being interfered with in order for it to actually exist as a domain in the first place, which kind of makes it very different now that I think about it from something like the seas or the air or land, which are the original kind of domains that we would think of.
Well, I mean, I like to think of outer space. Most space systems are the infrastructure for cyber. So a cyber attack isn't necessarily an attack on a space asset if it's attacking the software. Then I would consider it more like an attack on the network itself, or on whatever system they're trying to target. But there can be situations where cyber attacks can try to degrade space capabilities. And that's also something that we are quite worried about, because if someone, we've seen lots of situations where very clever hackers start probing around in various networks just to prove a point, sometimes playing a game. And if somebody were to get very far in certain networks, it could create a bit of chaos, just a big scare. And that's what we're one of the things that we're trying to find ways that if something like that were to happen, if somebody hacked into the U.S. Control and command system for nuclear weapons, like, is there a system that the U.S. could use to call China or to call Russia and try and scale down the tension before they decide, like, oh, this must be a precursor to a nuclear attack. Boom, let's go. Right.
Yeah, I mean, what are the systems? Is it, people actually call each other and... No?
We don't have a lot right now, especially with tensions being so high.
Right. I mean, the story went that when Donald Trump had to ring Malcolm Turnbull, they had to get his number from a friend of a friend. Right. So it was like there wasn't even a system there. It was like, oh, someone on the golf course had his number and they had a phone call. So Malcolm Turnbull was an Australian Prime Minister.
Yeah. For those who don't know.
Prime Ministers ago, just for not everyone's aware. You're not I think we're often not aware. So.
I think if a lot of media networks are to be believed, then Donald Trump probably has Vladimir Putin probably has Donald Trump's number on speed dial. I don't know if it's the other way around, but we do know that at least at the moment, there's not as much dialogue and not as much of an exchange as there used to be, and that creates very practical but very real challenges, such as if a drone is doing something really weird and getting close to an American military satellite, is there somebody that the Space Force guys could call and say, hey, are you intending to do this, or what's going on? What's that hotline? What does that look like? Who do they engage with? These are things that need to start getting worked out. And as we see more and more of these dedicated military space units come up, our question is, are you also seeking other diplomatic avenues and diplomatic mechanisms that you can use to scale down the tension in the event that these units start getting engaged?
How's your beer going?
I just finished the first one, and considering that I still have to work the rest of the day, I should probably not have a second.
I'm almost at the end of my scotch, so I'm feeling like we should probably wind up.
Okay.
But this has been a
pleasure.
really great chat, and I mean, how amazing to be able to speak to someone whose literal job it is to stop us bombing each other, or at least attempt to in some way. That's goals right there.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Is there anything you would like people watching or listening? Because I may also release this as a podcast, depending on the audio quality. Not that that's stopped me in the past, though. I have to say, I just put up an episode that's like an all-time low. And it's even worse than the one that was recorded on an airfield during an air show of military jets. So, yeah, it was the audio quality was pretty.
I think I listened to that one.
Yeah, it wasn't great. Anyway, but if people are to go and look anything up or think about anything or read anything, what should they be doing?
One of the big challenges that I keep coming across is not enough countries think this is relevant to them. I think most space actors see space security as being something that is really only relevant to the major space powers and ultimately the major nuclear powers. That's not true at all. The physics of space are such that if we start seeing a lot of conflict in orbit, it could degrade everybody's space services. Now, in the UN, we have this agenda item, the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And the way that I'm kind of reading the situation, it's not that we're seeing an arms race in outer space. It's that there is an arms race going on out there, and space is just a part of it. If that is the case, then the likelihood that we're going to see conflict move into space and start targeting space systems is pretty high. So other states, non-major military space powers, should still be looking at the situation and thinking, my population, my citizens rely on space services every day. This is an issue that we need to find a mechanism to work around, or mechanisms to work around, or we are also going to face the impacts of what could be a potential conflict in orbit. So I think that this is an issue that more states should be stressing and looking at, in addition to all the other problems that we're having at the moment. But at least trying to put some pressure on some of the major space powers to start taking some active steps, even if they're small, focused steps. But yeah, this just needs to be something that is it gets more engagement from Latin American countries, African countries, Southeast Asian countries. It's not just the big four countries. Even the Europeans, they have a big interest in this, despite the fact that they're not terribly keen on Star Wars.
Sure.
But
yeah,
that's it.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been awesome talking to you.
Always a pleasure.
I hope that you stay safe in Geneva, and at the very least, stay nerdy.
It's hard not to around here.
Yeah. Bye.
All right. Yeah, take care.